Good. I think we will just start because in the beginning we will anyways just discuss a little bit of the administrative parts, and I guess some more participants will join during this time. So welcome to our webinar about climate impacts and the textile industry. We are looking forward to a session where we will discuss the textile industry's role when it comes to climate change. We will dive deep into emission allocations and calculations, as well as how to activate your company to reduce your impacts. Before we start with the actual content of the webinar, let me talk about some basics of the Zoom webinar platform. You will all be muted during the webinar in order to ensure the best audio quality. Please feel free to send us any questions during the presentation via the question function. On the right-hand side on this slide, you can see a screenshot of the webinar window. And as you can see, you can find the icon to open the Q&A window in the bar at the bottom. And here you can type in your questions and send it to us. And we will reply to these questions in the end of the session. And also, after today's session, you will also receive the presentation as a handout. Today's session will be held by my colleague, Stefanie Rieder-Haas, who is our Sustainability Director, and myself, Janne Tesch. I'm a Sustainability Manager at Leadership and Sustainability. Leadership and Sustainability is a company focused on sustainability matters in the textile, hard goods, and consumer goods industry. We follow a holistic approach as we work on sustainability strategy and climate projects with brands, and are also closely working with supply chain actors with a global team of verifiers and auditors. Today's focus is the topic climate impacts in the textile industry. First of all, we will discuss climate impacts of the textile industry, which will directly answer why it makes sense for you as a business to act on climate-related topics. Then we will discuss how you can act, as we will talk about different climate tools. And as previously mentioned, at the end of the session, we will have time for questions and discussion. According to a Greenpeace study, 1 out of 5 pieces of clothing is never used. That means 1 out of 5 products you produce or you sell directly ends up as trash. However, 5 out of 5 products produced by textile companies lead to emissions. And it is important to understand that every extra bit of warming makes a difference, but so do our actions. Let us talk about the why. Why does every extra bit of warming make a difference? As we all know, CO2 emissions, thus global warming, and its severe impacts are projected to increase year by year. Even with a global warming increase below 1.5 Celsius, there will be irreversible impacts. The increasing global warming will lead to a variety of risks, like, for example, loss of biodiversity, health issues, or poor air quality. There are geographical locations that will be affected even more than others. And these geographical locations are often those where textiles are produced. Thus, every extra bit of warming will lead to more risks. On the one hand, for society or the environment, and on the other hand, for your business stability and profitability. The textile industry itself accounts for around 4% of global emissions. It depends on which study you look at, but it can be said around 4% of global emissions. And this means the emissions are as high as emissions from France, Germany, and the UK. And where do most of the emissions from the textile supply chain occur? As you can see on this graph on the slide, most of the emissions reside from the production of textiles, Tier 4 raw materials extraction until Tier 1. Transport and retail, or also logistics with warehouses, thus the operations often held in the hands of a brand, do account for a smaller proportion, as you can see on the graph. And almost a quarter lays within the indirect product use and end of life, thus the consumer. This already illustrates the challenge. Who holds the responsibility for emissions? Who is in charge of acting better for climate? It needs a holistic perspective on climate impacts in order to be able to act and go into a real emission reduction. But how can we as a business even go into emission reduction? Let us talk about several climate tools that help with that. First of all, we will talk about the concept of carbon footprinting in general, as this is the first step to understand your climate impact. Then we will discuss carbon footprinting verifications. Calculating and understanding your impact is challenging. It might help to get an external review on your method and inventory. And lastly, we will cover science-based targets. As we all know, carbon footprinting itself does not reduce your impact. Setting targets means you really take action and go into a reduction. Let us start with the topic of carbon footprinting. The carbon footprint is a measure of the exclusive total amount of greenhouse gas emissions that is directly and indirectly caused by an activity or is accumulated over all life stages of a product. A widely known and accepted standard for your carbon footprint is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. This is why we recommend to calculate your emissions based on the protocol and to follow its 5 accounting principles, which you can see on this slide. These 5 principles emphasize the importance of a robust calculation method and especially the need for transparency around challenges and data lags, because challenges and data lags is something that is really normal when you calculate your carbon footprint. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol defines 3 different scopes of emissions. Scope 1 emissions are owned and controlled by the company. For example, this could be your own company vehicles. Scope 2 emissions result from the generation of electricity, heat, and steam that are purchased by your business. And Scope 3 emissions are a consequence of activities in the company's supply chain. Thus, they originate from sources that are not owned or controlled by your company. Thus, when talking about it from a brand perspective, let us look at the graph from the beginning once again. Your Scope 1 and 2 emissions are your headquarter activities, maybe including retail and logistics. It always depends on if you own the retail stores, if you have an own warehouse or not. But we could say in general, the white color could be your Scope 1 and 2 emissions. Scope 3 emissions are the upstream activities resulting from textile production, thus the green colored parts. And Scope 3 downstream activities could be logistics again, as well as indirect product use and end of life, the gray part of the diagram. As you can see from the brand perspective, most of the emissions do not lay within your owned and controlled operations. And this will also be a reality for Tier 1 or Tier 2 suppliers. This leads to typical challenges when preparing a carbon footprint. Some examples are lack of qualitative data and access to real activity data. Thus, oftentimes, reporting companies need to rely on extrapolations or assumptions, which then might lead to less accuracy in your calculations. Oftentimes, systems for data collections are not available, and it takes a lot of time and resources to develop such a system. There might be a lack of expertise, which will make it even more difficult to implement a robust calculation system. And again, as the graph shows, highest emissions might be occurring outside your owned and controlled operations, which makes it even more challenging to understand your exact impact on climate. In the end, the high complexity of textile value chains and company structures lead to a lot of challenges when collecting and calculating emission data. Yes, there are quite some challenges, but these are normal, and we want to encourage you to try it out and to do your best. There's a lot of movement right now, and more helpful resources get published. To summarize carbon footprinting, let me go over the basic calculation method behind carbon footprinting. As you can see on this slide, the activity data is multiplied with an emission factor and again multiplied with the global warming potential of this factor so that the sum shows the CO2 equivalent of emissions. This helps to make the results of a carbon footprint more comparable. Activity data could be, for example, liters of fuel consumed or kilograms of material utilized. The emission factor represents the emission per unit. Emission factors are normally available in public resources or databases that you need to purchase. And the global warming potential factor is used to convert all numbers down to CO2 because we want to come to the CO2 equivalent. Here, for example, CO2 has a global warming potential of 1 at 100 years, but methane, for example, would have a global warming potential of 21 in 100 years. As explained in the previous slide, one big challenge is to collect correct activity data. It's really challenging to find the activity data, to go into the details of your primary data that you use, and then to calculate exact figures. And another challenge is to find appropriate emission factors, because it is not that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol gives you a list of the emission factors that you should be using. There are a lot of different databases outside, a lot of different documents that you could use, and then it can be difficult to decide for the correct emission factor. But with the help of resources and documents, as well as expert knowledge, a carbon footprint can be calculated, and it will lay the foundation for understanding your impact and will be your first step when acting on climate impacts. Now I will hand over to Stephanie, who will go into the details of reviewing your calculation, robustness with the greenhouse gas verification, as well as acting on your impacts.
Yeah, thank you very much, Janne. Third-party verification becomes more and more important in our increasingly complex industrial environment. Who of you didn't at some point have a strange gut feeling when buying a product claiming to be carbon neutral or is something else that had to do with climate or carbon footprinting? It's all just too much to digest for a normal consumer. And therefore, you need trust. Trust can, on the one hand, be created through a brand image, and it can be completely underlined, proven by verification. And therefore, verification becomes more and more important. New legislation will also make those verification processes more and more important in the future. So it's not only the consumers asking for it, but it's also the legislative. So it absolutely makes sense for you to also have a carbon footprinting verified from a business perspective. But how does a verification work? Together with a service provider, you clarify the process of your calculations in a kickoff. You explain your methods, get a clear view of the process. After that, you will transmit all your documentation. So you will transmit your different factors, your emission factors, your data, your files, and then the documents get scanned and checked through so-called sample checkups. And the more strict the data is, the less sample checkups are necessary. And if there is anything found, so the scan will go a little bit deeper. The questions is the data correct? Did you use reliable emission factors? Are calculations valid? And any open questions are then also clarified in a qualitative interview. In case there is any findings, you will also there find suggestions later on, or you will be pointed to the points that are not correct, and you will be able to improve your methodology in the end. And in the end, you receive an assurance statement stating that your approach is valid. Thus, on the one hand, you get an external proof in order to enhance trust for your customers or consumers, and get an external perspective on your methodology and can improve for future calculation. And here again, you can see that carbon footprinting is really to be seen as a continuous improvement process. Nobody has done it right in the first step. It's really important to get started and then year per year improve yourself and regard it as a process. An essentially important tool for that, for setting up that process, is the science-based targets. The Science-Based Targets Initiative is a corporate climate action organization that helps companies and also financial institutions all over the world to fulfill their part in fighting the climate crisis. So what does Science-Based Targets do? Science-based targets provide a clearly defined pathway for companies to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. They can help prevent the worst impacts of climate change and also enable you for future business growth. Science-based targets help companies to specify how much and how quickly they need to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. They help you to define what actions are there that need to be taken, and they're aligned to the Paris Agreement. And what is very important, and which we would like to point out during this webinar now, we're focusing on climate impacts, but climate is one focus topic, which is mirrored in the science-based targets. And as you might probably know, there's already more initiatives of the science-based targets initiatives going more towards nature and environment. However, it is very, very important to start with the first step, and the most elaborated step currently is the focus on climate. So what do you have to do in order to get aligned with science-based targets? We know now that science-based targets help us with an international framework and can give us really, really good guidance. But what is there to do next? It's very basically phrased 4 steps you need to consider, which will give structure to your reduction approach. First, you need to decide on which data you will use to set your baseline. You need to choose a base year. And for that year, calculate your emissions. We'll come to that later on in a second again. Second point, have a really close look at your results and set goals. Goals for the different scopes that Janne already gave you an explanation for. And that is different for the different types of companies and for the different types of business. Third, you might find out that your data has improved over the time, or you need to refine your methodology. And I'm again referring to that process that we talked about earlier. It is a process, so you might have to recalculate your base year emissions in order to be able to set up your roadmap to fulfill your reduction goals. And that is a really important step. And last but not least, account for your emissions. Get your data in line, take action, implement measures, reduce your emissions, and communicate your successes and also your challenges. And for some of you, also very important, the small and medium enterprises, the so-called SMEs, can follow a less complex approach. You will receive this slide later on in order to check out the applicability for the so-called SMEs, and you can then see what factors apply and whether you fall under this category. Let's get more into some of the details regarding science-based targets. There's 3 different time horizons to consider. One, you have the baseline year. Then you have so-called near-term targets, and the other ones are long-term targets. But what is the baseline? The baseline is the year you choose from 2015 onwards. Scope 1 and 2 need to have the same baseline year. And you shouldn't choose a year where is a one-sided rare experience, as this can really distort the data for your reduction efforts. Just to name one keyword, for example, it is COVID. The baseline year that you choose should have verifiable data on scope 1, 2, and 3. And it also allows you sufficient forward-looking ambition. Let's get to the next point. What is a near-term target? A near-term target should be about 5 to 10 years in the future. It has to cover 95% of scope 1 and 2. And if scope 3 represents more than 40% of the total emissions, it is necessary to set a target that covers at least 67% of scope 3 as well. Let's come to the third one, long-term targets. Long-term targets serve for 2050 or sooner. It's not really specified there, but it should definitely be longer than 10 years after baseline year. It must cover at least 95% of scope 1 and 2 and at least 90% of scope 3. And together with that, we also refer to net zero targets. The target year should be the latest year of long-term targets. For example, if a company has 2 long-term targets, for example, for 2035 and 2050, the net zero target year must be 2050. The idea is that your company then has 0 emissions until that target year. An essential step with SBT is the target setting. Here, a company has two different options: setting absolute or setting intensity targets. An absolute target is referring to the total amount of emissions being emitted. And an intensity target is a normalized metric that sets a company's emission targets relative to some sort of economic output, like, for example, your revenue. As you can see in the graph, the reduction will be reached with an absolute target in a quicker and stricter way. However, not every business can cope with that rapid change and might choose the possibility to set intensity targets. And as I said, that might be, for example, in relation to their revenue. So you might wonder now, so how can I set an absolute target because I might not, or an intensity target because I might not reduce the same amount of emissions as when I set an absolute target? Science-based target has here a very clear line. Intensity targets are only eligible for science-based targets when they're aligned with your absolute emissions. So intensity targets will only be eligible when they lead to absolute emission reduction targets in line with the different climate scenarios. And from our perspective, we would always recommend to set absolute targets in the first place. However, intensity target setting in the end also leads to a reduction. It might be a very valuable option for your business type. And just to give you a quick idea what you can do in order to also get into actions, because we talked about actions before, there's different things in the different value chain segments that you can address. The most important thing, in our opinion, however, is that you need to hold yourself accountable. So you should set smart targets. You have to get responsibility to certain persons or groups, and you need to set a very clear reduction timeline. Monitor the progress and adjust the plan. That sounds, everything sounds very easy, but however, it's not always as easy as we think, because along with that, there's always a lot of challenges. Target setting and reduction is a long-term invest. It's a long-term invest with considerable cost, which you need to really root in your business. You need to become aware of the fact that all measures that you're taking right now, there's no short-term success, but it needs a very strategic approach, and you need to convince the decision makers in your company. And that leads us to the next thing, transformation. Science-based targets are also carbon footprinting reduction is closely connected or can be seen as a transformation process. You need to really root all the different initiatives that you have, the targets, the responsibilities deep in your core business, because only if the whole business is aligned, then you will come into a successful reduction phase. Janne already talked about it. Complexity of data is a big challenge that companies are facing, but don't get disencouraged by it. It's always a first step. It's a reiteration process, and every year you will get your data in line. But only when you start, you can actually improve your data, and you can go to the core of the things you need to know. For the textile supply chain, it's even more characteristic. Many businesses, or even smaller businesses, have more than 100 suppliers in the supply chain. Everything is a deep network. It's very complex, and what you need is supply chain transparency. And what we see currently also in the legislative, like politics are pushing us towards that transparency. And that's a very positive thing. You need to collect your data. You need to know who you're working with, because only together, in the end, we can really make a difference. And then something that is very much underestimated is the implementation phase. Get your KPIs together, get your data together, get your monitoring processes implemented in order to really get into action and not only to remain at goal setting. And now we come to the opportunities. Did you know that 2 out of 3 factories are, because of responsible purchasing practices of brand, already able to cover some costs with their orders? And they have the possibility through their partnerships to create a dialogue with their business partners about the levers of carbon reduction in the supply chain. 3 out of 4 fashion brands could reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by more than 60% for less than 1 or 2% of their revenues. You just need to know where to look at and what to do. And coming to the customer side, 4 out of 5 pieces of clothing are used by our customers. Their footprint can be reduced immensely through change of behavior and through customer education. And therefore, we would like to sum it up. We think that the key to success in carbon footprinting and in carbon reduction are in the end collaborative actions. You need to talk to your business partners. The textile supply chain is people business. So let's build on that. Let's keep the people in the picture, and those relationships will in the end lead to empowerment, to collaboration, and to education, and it will help us to create impact, because every extra bit of warming makes a difference, and so really will your action. So our recommendation, get your data together, dive into the nitty-gritty details, plan your roadmap, get your stakeholders on board, and start to make it. Thank you very much for your attention. And with that, we would like to get into our Q&A session. And we have a question in the chat. How does upcycling-based impact venture diverting landfill, destined fresh fabric scraps from landfills set its science-based targets? I'm not completely sure about the question. Janne, maybe you can help with the interpretation, or Mamta, maybe you can give us a bit more of input to that.
I think that would help if we would get a little bit of more input. Thank you.
So, Mamta, did you mean that how upcycling helps with science-based targets? Maybe you can rephrase the questions and we'll try it again and go over to the next question. How can I identify which category is in scope 3 and which category is necessary to calculate and which is not?
This is a really good question, because with that you already summarized that for each of the reporting companies, not all scope 3 categories have to be calculated. This is the first thing that needs to be understood. And then, yes, it is important to understand which scope 3 categories are applicable for you as a reporting company. So what we recommend is that in the first step, you could do like a screening. So we recommend to look at all the different categories and look at different criteria. Is it important from a perspective of do you spend a lot of monetary value there? Do you have a lot of impact in this section? And also, what really helps is that you look for different studies where you can already see like a little bit of the allocation of the scope 3 emissions. Because if you think you only account for 1% of the scope 3 emissions with one category, you could leave it out in the first step. But what we really recommend, if you are a textile company, category 1, purchased goods and services, normally accounts for the biggest proportion of emissions. So this really needs to be included. But to really understand which categories need to be included by you, we recommend a screening study. And this is also asked by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So what I would recommend to you is that you go to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and look at the different criteria that they recommend for your screening study.
Thank you very much, Janne. There's another question. How can I differentiate between carbon neutral and net zero target? Or how to achieve carbon neutral and net zero? Yanni, do you want to go ahead with that one as well?
So I would start with explaining net zero. So with net zero, what is meant is that the Science Based Target Initiatives knows that it is not possible, even if you implement the best measures of the world, to achieve a zero emission inventory, greenhouse gas inventory. So net zero means you reduce all your emissions that you can reduce, and then the net comes into place when you have measures in place where you invest money into projects that give you carbon credits. But this is the last step. So in the very first steps, you need to reduce your emissions yourself. Yes.
There's also been two other questions that have already been answered in the chat. How did the end of line, how was end of line calculated, with what baseline? And we put a resource here into the chat. And also confirming that the PowerPoint and the recording of the webinar will be sent out afterwards. There's one more question. You talked about empowering factories. My question will be, in what capacity are you empowering? So I think I will get, I will move forward with that question. So it is, we said it's about collaboration. Empowering factories for us also means it's a collaborative effort. So it is about the brands, capacity building, giving training to the factories in a collaborative effort. That could be a measure that different brands get together and map their supply chains in the textile supply chain. That is really a measure that might be very helpful. So that might be one thing that we could categorize as empowerment, that training is given to the suppliers in order to understand the effects better, also in understanding the market demands better, and in the end, then collaborate together on the reduction. Because what we want to refrain from is to only focus on the points where the reduction can take place. Like, for example, it's materials, it's the material producers. They are not the only ones responsible for that, but it is the whole supply chain that needs to take actions. So for us, empowering means to create an understanding and also get together the resources in order to go into reduction, because responsibility for us cannot only be with one single stakeholder. So hopefully we were able to answer that question also. And with that, as there is no more questions popping up, we would like to give you a short overview of the services of leadership and sustainability. As Janne already let you know, it's a holistic approach. So on the one hand side, we support brands and companies out of the supply chain with strategic questions, also with double materiality questions, also with carbon footprinting and SBT support. We can train and empower your team, so help you with supplier education, but also with employee trainings. We offer different verification and assurance services. And the very special thing about leadership and sustainability, we also have a global team of auditors and verifiers right in the supply chain. So we do have as well the brand perspective as the supply chain perspective. So if there's any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to help, and we thank you very much for your time, and hope to see you during our next webinar. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.